US President Donald Trump has announced plans to impose a 100% tariff on generic drug imports from August 2028, jumping to 200% the following year. The move forms part of a plan to boost pharmaceutical production within the United States, but there are fears the changes could impact access to crucial medicines. Well, let's speak to Deborah Gleeson, who is a professor of public health at Latrobe University. Now, Professor, does it make sense to you, Donald Trump's rationale for increasing tariffs on generic drugs imported into the US?
Thanks, Yvonne, and thanks for having me on the show this evening. It doesn't make a lot of sense, the policy that Donald Trump has announced. I think he's got two competing objectives. He wants to lower drug prices for Americans, but he also wants to bring manufacturing onshore in America. And of course, that will actually raise the prices of generic drugs. So it's not a very sensible policy from a health point of view. Of course, there's a big question around whether this will actually even happen. As we know, Donald Trump has made a lot of these sorts of announcements before. In fact, last year he made an announcement that there would be 200% tariffs on brand name drugs, and then he walked that back quite a bit. It came down to 100%, and then now there's all sorts of exceptions for drug companies that are bringing drug manufacturing to the US. Exceptions for particular countries that have negotiated agreements. And so when that actually comes into effect at the end of July, it's not likely to have much of an effect. And I think we'll probably see the same sorts of things happen with this announced tariff on generic drugs. I think the reason why Donald Trump has done this right now is because, that 100% tariff is supposed to be going into effect on brand name drugs soon, and it's actually not going to make very much of a difference to anything. So it's more for the announcement effect rather than anything else, I think. And the US is also negotiating a trade agreement with India at the moment, so it may be a strategy to ensure that the US has leverage in those negotiations.
Of course, a lot of generic drugs come from India. How dependent are American consumers on generic drugs?
Well, generic drugs make up about 90% of the drugs that are prescribed in the United States, and more than half of those drugs come overseas. And India's the biggest maker of generic drugs in the developing world. So this seems to be targeted particularly at India. Of course, many other countries would be affected by that as well if it does come into play. Not so much Australia, because we don't have a very big drug industry here. There are not many generics made in Australia, and we import most of our drugs from overseas. But really, it's drug prices for Americans that will be the issue, and America already pays more than double the amount per capita for medicines than Australia, and in fact more than double the average for any OECD country. So this could have a big effect on the costs for Americans.
And what about Australians back home? Will this policy, if it goes ahead and these tariffs are imposed in a few years' time, could it possibly have knock-on effects, or might it affect Australia's pharmaceutical benefits scheme in any way?
So it's hard to say, because I think it would be quite a disruption to the global pharmaceutical market. If we see more generic production moving away from countries like India to high-income countries, that means much higher production costs. Some companies may just pull out of the market because they don't want to, there are already very thin margins for generic drugs, and it just may not be commercially feasible for them to produce drugs anymore. So I think, it's hard to predict what the effects could be further down the track. But in terms of Australia's PBS, I think there are two other things that are happening at the moment in terms of pressures from the US that are actually more important for us to be concerned about. One of them is what the Trump administration calls a most favoured nation drug pricing policy, which means that drug companies are being pressured not to set lower prices in other countries than are set in the US. And the drug companies are now passing on that pressure to countries like Australia that have tight price controls on medicines. And so we're seeing the sorts of behaviour that's been in the news over the last few weeks where big drug companies are threatening to withdraw medicines from the PBS because they don't want to pay the prices that the Australian government is prepared to pay. We've also, in the last few weeks, seen the Trump administration launch an investigation into Germany's drug pricing policies with the threat of more tariffs hanging over Germany's head if it doesn't change its drug pricing. So there are a lot of threats in the current environment, but it's really important that Australia keeps its careful assessment of whether drugs are cost effective, whether they actually increase, they improve patients' lives, and whether they're worth paying what the drug companies are asking for, and that we don't sort of have a knee-jerk reaction to these pressures, and make sure that we don't end up paying too much for drugs that are not more effective than what we already have.
Professor Deborah Gleeson, really good to get your thoughts on this topic. Thank you so much for joining The World.
Thank you very much, Yvonne.